My name is Kylie Goodfellow, and my composer was Johannes Brahms. So, Johannes Brahms was born on May 7th, 1833, in Hamburg, Germany. His parents were Johann Jakob and Christine Brahms. Johannes was named after his father and his grandfather. He was named Johannes because Johannes means son of Johann. So his father was named Johann, and then his grandfather was named Johann. Johannes's father loved music just as much as Johannes did. He always wanted to be a composer and a great musician, which he never was, but he still loved music. He actually ran away from home as a teenager to take music from a local teacher because his father disapproved of music lessons. So Johannes Brahms was born in very terrible conditions. He was born in a tenant house, very filthy, very rundown, very bad people basically living there. So he was born in not a good situation, but he came out of that as he got older. He had one brother and one sister. Their names were Friedrich and Elizabeth Brahms. And Johannes began his own education at the age of 6 at a private school. At age 11, he was moved to a progressive school which was run by Johann Friedrich Hoffmann. He received a good education in mathematics, natural history, and he also learned some English and French. Now, his musical education began when he was 4. His father decided to teach him how to play the violin, the cello, and the valveless walled horn. Even at such a young age, Johannes already had a musical gift. His father learned that he had perfect pitch, and Johannes also learned how to write his own music as far as writing down the actual notes. He didn't realize that there was already a system of how to write down notes, so he made up his own way. So this made his father very happy because he knew that his son would be the great musician that he himself never was and always dreamed of being. So that was a neat thing for him. So after he trained his son a little bit, he decided finally to turn him over to more qualified teachers so that they could train him to be an orchestral player. Johannes learned how to play the cello very well, but after a while he insisted on learning how to play the piano. And this didn't make sense to his father since there was no piano in the house, and he refused him the opportunity. But finally, after Johannes kept asking, his father finally allowed him to take lessons, and he took lessons from Otto Friedrich Willibald Kossel, who had studied under the teachings of Edward Markson. This was very important, and a very important part in Johannes's life because Herr Kossel gave him the foundation in music that he needed, and really drilled him in all of his studies so that he would get the best foundation possible in music. But as time went on, Johannes demanded not only learn how to play music, but he wanted to learn how to compose it. Herr Kossel could not teach him how to compose since he himself did not know how to compose, so eventually he turned him over to his own old teacher, Edward Markson. So Johannes began taking lessons from Edward Markson, and at first Markson didn't really see any special talent in Johannes, but he soon changed his first impression. Later in his life, this is a quote from him. He says, quote, "When I started teaching him composition, he exhibited a rare acuteness of mind which enchanted me, and, insignificant though his first attempts at original creation turned out to be, I was bound to recognize them an intelligence which convinced me that an exceptional, great, and peculiarly profound talent was dormant in him. I therefore shrank from no effort or work in order to awaken and form it, that I might one day rear a priest of art, who should preach in new accents what a sublime, true, and eternally incorruptible art." So Markson ended up changing his tone and devoted all his energies to teaching him everything he could. And at age 14, Johannes played his first piano recital in which he played one of his own pieces. So jumping ahead pretty far into his life. Lots of things happened, but one of the major things that happened in his life was when he met Robert Schumann and his wife Clara. Now, Robert Schumann was a very famous musician, and his wife was also a musician as well. But Robert Schumann helped Johannes get some of his earliest works published, and he actually got an invitation for him to play at the, I'm not very good with the German names, but I'm going to do my best, the Gewandhaus in Leipzig. But so after he got him the invitation, the Schumanns allowed Johannes to live with them for 3 months, and they became the best of friends. When Robert Schumann died in 1856, after a while, Johannes Brahms actually fell in love with his widow Clara. So there's been a lot of speculation of, did they get married? Was this true? From all indications, they did not get married, although they very much loved one another. But someone quoted it this way, quote, or talking about Clara, quote, "She was the widow of the great Robert Schumann, and she became a professional widow who wore mourning clothes all her life. That is not to say that she and Brahms were anything but close. If nothing else, the memory of the man they both loved would have kept them together. They needed each other, and they inspired each other." So they remained pretty much good friends all their lives, but Johannes never married. So Johannes's career as a composer was very interesting. He was a romantic composer, but he, quote, breathed new life into the classical form. So he was very familiar with Bach, Beethoven, all of the classical composers. One of his greatest wishes was to conduct the Philharmonic Orchestra in Hamburg, but they never actually allowed him to do that. So in 1862, he left Hamburg and went to Vienna. And while there, he did several things, including conducting the Academy of Singing for 2 years, and he actually settled down in a house and stayed there for the rest of his life in Vienna. But Brahms's first piece, which you'll listen to after this presentation, was called A German Requiem. This was his first piece that made him famous, but the first time it was heard, only 3 sections of it were heard, and it was very disliked. But this was contributed to the fact that it was not performed well. So in 1868, Brahms himself actually conducted a German Requiem, and after that it became very popular. This is a quote talking about Brahms himself conducting the performance, and it says, quote, "Never had the cathedral been so full, never had the enthusiasm been so great. The effect was simply overwhelming, and it became clear to the audience that a German Requiem ranked among the loftiest music ever given to the world." So after a German Requiem got its fame, he pretty much gave up conducting after a while and began composing music for a living, and thus kept his publisher very well supplied. At first, he didn't write symphonies because he didn't want to be measured with Bach when he didn't feel like he was as good as Bach. But he wrote anything and everything between except for operas. So finally, in 1876, after much urging from his friends, he completed and performed his #1 symphony. And after this, 3 other symphonies followed. Quote, "He was now recognized as a master, and befitting a master, he was continually surrounded by admirers." So, again, after these symphonies, his fame just kept growing and growing and growing. Continuing in this quote, "His genius was recognized not only in Vienna, but in the rest of Europe as well. And in 1879, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy was conferred on him by the University of Breslau." Another one of Johannes's pieces was his 4th symphony. This was composed in 1885, but it wasn't very popular at first. But it was a turning point in his life, because after this symphony was composed, his style changed to be, quote, more gentle and reflective. People didn't really like the number 4 symphony at first. It was in E minor, and it was, quote, considered too secretive, and its key of E minor, rather um, unconventional, bothered some musicians. Um, so there was mixed. Uh, uh, there was people who liked some of his stuff, and then people who some things were like, that doesn't sound very great. But as time went on, his fame would just continue to grow. So Brahms continued composing until his death in 1897. He attended his last concert on March 7th, 1897, and died 1 month later on April 3rd, 1897, at the age of 63. So he lived a pretty good life, but his legacy is quite immense. Even though he didn't live a very good life as far as biblical terms, he lived somewhat of an immoral life, and everything that he did was not always biblical, but he still left an amazing legacy with his music. This quote says, quote, Brahms can be said to bear the same relation to his times that Bach did to his own. Bach was the culmination of the age of counterpoint, Brahms of the age of romanticism. If Brahms had never lived, the course of musical evolution would have been unaltered. But both composers brought such richness of speech to an existing style, such increased flexibility to existing forms, such majesty and grandeur of expression to existing idioms, that in their works music becomes alive. So even though Johannes wasn't maybe not have been as good as Bach, he still was compared to Bach in the fact that they both had the same influence over their time periods of music. So where Bach would have had influence over his time, Johannes had influence over the Romantic period and all of that kind of music.